Sounds good. And we're live. Thanks, Katie. I'm going to give it just a second for the rest of the attendees to exit the waiting room, and we'll get started here in just a second. Okay, the number is slowing. I'm going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Woodard, Executive Director of the Iowa State Association of Counties. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for being here. Quick housekeeping items before we get started. I do want to mention that the webinar will be recorded. Additionally, please feel free to place your questions in the chat function. We will be sure to pause between each section, making sure that we provide an opportunity for those to be answered and any other questions to be shared and responded to. Today, we have three important topics that we'll be covering. The first is an overview of an amendment to the ISAC Articles of Incorporation. Next, we'll go over the 2025 legislative priorities and package, and finally, an update on compensation boards. The webinar will start with the amendment to the article, so I'm going to pass it to Christy Hirschberger to kick us off. Thank you again for being here.
All right, thank you, Andrea, and thanks everybody for being here. Courtney, if you want to advance the slide, please. We will get started talking about some amendments that we are proposing to ISAC's articles. I've got to give you a little bit of background and history on this issue so you know why we're doing what we're doing. So I apologize for delving into a little bit of tax law, but that's why we're doing what we're doing. So as most of you may know, ISAC is a private nonprofit entity organized under Iowa Code Chapter 504. Private nonprofit entities can also be considered what's called an instrumentality of the government for tax purposes. And I think there's 5 or 6 prongs of a test that you have to meet for that qualification. ISAC's position has always been that we qualify as an instrumentality of government, and we have requested a private letter ruling from the IRS to determine our status under Internal Revenue Code, Section 115. Next slide, please. So this has been an important issue for the ISAC board for a number of years now. And that's because qualifying as an instrumentality of government isn't just important for purposes of our tax status, but this idea of whether or not we're an instrumentality of government comes up in a lot of different ways for ISAC, under a lot of different laws and a lot of different programs. So for example, whether or not we have to comply with FMLA, there's student loan forgiveness programs that we may or may not qualify depending upon this tax status. In working with the IRS on getting this private letter ruling, we have found that ISAC needs to make some changes to our governing documents in order to show that ISAC is controlled by the counties. Next slide, please. So that's why we're doing all of this, is to demonstrate to the IRS that ISAC is controlled by the counties, which I think is something that we all understand to be true, but we need a little more documentation in our articles and our bylaws to do that. So to that end, the ISAC Board of Directors is proposing the following changes, and I'm going to kind of go through just the categories of changes that we're proposing. If you want to see an actual red line or a clean version of the articles with those changes put in, those are linked in the email that you got about this webinar. Each county is also going to be getting a paper copy in the mail of the redlined articles, along with a notice about voting on these changes. If for any reason you can't find either one of those, just let me know and I will get it sent over to you. But so the big change is that we're clarifying, not a big change, really. Most of these changes are not substantive, just clarifications. Clarifying that the counties of Iowa, which pay their dues to ISAC, are the members. So this idea that the members are the counties, not necessarily the individuals within those counties, although you guys have all the same rights that you've always had with ISAC, even with these changes. Establishing that the Board of Supervisors of each county designates the county voting representatives. This is not a change to who can vote on ISAC matters. So currently, as we'll talk about actually later on the voting process, voting members are all elected officials and the principal officer for each county department represented by an affiliated association of ISAC. That's still who the county voting representatives are under these changes. This change is designed to demonstrate to the IRS that it's the counties that control ISAC, act and vote on ISAC matters. It becomes sort of a theoretical discussion because counties in themselves are a geographical area, which obviously they cannot take any action. So what we're trying to show is that a county acts through its individual elected officials and appointed officials. And so that's the kind of the step that we're adding to try to show to the IRS that it is the county doing that. So by having the Board of Supervisors designate those representatives, it's intended to demonstrate that it is the county taking action on ISAC business. Again, it's not a change to who can vote. And we've had a few questions come in. So, what happens if our supervisors don't designate our county voting representatives? Or what happens if they designate, the deputy auditor instead of the auditor? This change is designed to be kind of what I'm going to call a rubber stamp requirement. Much like what you see if you've heard my county structure presentation, you see throughout the code with the boards of supervisors. So a deputy is appointed, the elected official sets the salary, the county supervisor shall approve that appointment and the salary. So this is the same kind of idea. If for some reason your board of supervisors does not take action to designate the county voting representatives, then it will just go back to ISAC making that determination. If for some reason the supervisors were to list someone other than an elected official or the department head of a department that is an affiliate of ISAC, we'd go back to them and say, that's not within the definition of county voting representative. So it shouldn't be any sort of substantive change to who can vote. Next slide, please. And then there are a few other changes throughout the articles. So we are reiterating that individual county voting representatives do not have capacity on their own to vote. They're only able to vote as the representative of their county. It's a little bit repetitive, but again, this is what the IRS is asking for. It's not a substantive change. You've always been acting on behalf of your counties when you're voting. We're just saying it over and over in our articles and our bylaws now. Also clarifying that all county officials and employees of dues-paying counties have the right to participate in events and activities of ISAC. This is just to make sure everyone understands that even if you're not a county voting representative, you're still able to attend our events at the member price. You're still able to reach out to all of our staff, just like always, even with these changes. We also added a statement that all members of the ISAC Board of Directors shall be county voting representatives. Again, not a substantive change. That's always been the case. The way our ISAC board members are appointed has not changed. That will still go through the affiliate process. But all of our board members have always been elected officials or department heads of an affiliate of ISAC. And then there were some additional changes made that were kind of ministerial in nature, just to consistently use terminology throughout the document. So for example, we used to have a couple places where we talked about ISAC as the corporation and a couple places where we talked about ISAC as the association. So we've just made that consistent. And then we're also updating ISAC's registered agent with Andrea's appointment. We needed to make that change. So those are all the changes to the articles. I will pause briefly to see if there's any questions. I don't see in the chat. Oh, Katie put the articles in the chat. So if you'd like a link to that, to take a look at those, that's in there. Thank you, Katie. Well, if there are any other questions that come up after this, or you're listening to this in a recorded version, please feel free to reach out. As we'll mention later, those article changes will be voted on at the same time as the legislative priorities for 2025. Please make sure to vote. It is a 2/3 threshold that we need to approve those changes. So if you have any questions or concerns, anytime we'd be happy to talk with you about those. And with that, I'll say thank you for your time and turn it over to Jamie and Lucas to talk about our legislative priorities.
I see. Do we have one question here, Christy, quick from Joe?
Yeah, do come up. I don't recall our Board of Supervisors voting for these members. So this is a change. In the past, and in some ways, I think it'll be helpful. In the past, ISAC has made the determination on who's the voting members. And with this change, assuming it's approved, then we will have the boards of supervisors just pass a resolution. So in some cases, it'll provide some clarification for everybody. I know, for example, the IT affiliate, they sometimes have a question about who their department head is. Is it the IT director? Is it the GIS director? And so this way we'll just be getting some feedback from the counties on that. So if your board of supervisors has not previously done this, it's because it hasn't been required in the past.
All right, seeing no additional questions, thank you, Christy. And so what Lucas and I will do for the second part of this webinar is give a brief update of where we are in terms of the development of the legislative package for ISAC for 2025. And what we will, at the end of this presentation, we will also provide the voting dates and details for the online voting process that we will provide additional information on the full legislative package for the full ISAC membership to vote on. And that will then go to the ISAC Board of Directors for final ratification coming up here in November. So the first one on the conduct of elections comes from the county auditors in trying to address a situation in regard to the mailing of absentee ballots and then also in-person absentee voting, and try to provide a separation of 5 days between the mailing and then in-person absentee voting, because we've had in times past a number of individuals come to the courthouse and wanting to vote in person, but they've also requested an absentee ballot previously and might have forgotten about that. This provides that separation to allow for those ballots to be mailed to the person requesting the ballot, and reducing the duplication that we've seen in previous years. Next comes confidentiality of information, comes from community services and also public health. We've seen cases in state HIPAA law that exceeds the federal standards and so forth. And we just want to make sure that those state standards match the federal standards as well. Next is county access to the Iowa Communications Network, or ICN. This was also voted on by the ISAC Legislative Policy Committee and recommended as a top legislative priority for 2025. And this will allow all counties to have access to the ICN.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Our next one is on driver's license testing fee. This is a new proposal from the treasurers and basically calls for a $10 fee for when individuals have to take a driving test at the treasurer's station. Currently, there is no fee. And so like many things, that cost is being absorbed and is largely paid for by property tax. And so we're just asking to change that more to a user fee.
Next is on emergency management funding and governance. This is came to us from the Emergency Management Association, trying to address an issue that we've seen in disagreements between boards of supervisors and emergency management over budgetary matters and also funding as well.
And EMS, the special levy in TIF districts is a new proposal, came from an individual supervisor, but this will be a policy statement for the supervisor's affiliate and a proposed objective for the ISAC package. And this is attempting to say that if the voters approve an EMS levy, that revenue should not be divided out into a TIF district. It should go towards what the voters wanted and intended it to be used for, which is EMS. And next slide, please.
Next, this comes from the supervisors again this year in regard to eminent domain, specifically in the use in regard to carbon-based pipelines. It basically simply says that ISAC does not support the use of eminent domain in regard to carbon-based pipelines. Next is on the funding of state mandates, and this is also recommended by the ISAC LPC to be one of the top priorities for 2025. And certainly, many of you are aware of, or most of you are aware of all the many mandates that are placed on the state from the housing of HHS offices and from courthouse security, juvenile detention, amongst a number of different things. And certainly as a result of the property tax bill of House File 718, the need for funding of those state mandates, fully funding of those state mandates is needed more than ever, because if they aren't, that falls on the backs of local property tax payers. Next is also recommended a top priority for ISAC for 2025 on Iowa's natural resources, outdoor recreation, and water quality and quantity. And this is basically calling for the Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund that hasn't been funded. It was passed as a constitutional amendment, but it has never been fully funded, putting in the funding mechanism and so forth. And if the funding mechanism would be put in place, then ultimately another part of this priority is the full funding of REAP at $20 million. Next is also a recommended top priority from the ISAC LPC, and that's on Medicaid funding. Certainly on those reimbursement rates, have a number of them haven't been updated in a number of different years, from rural hospitals to EMS to rural dentistry, mental health. While there was some increases to providers certainly last year, certainly more needs to be done. And all across the board, the Medicaid reimbursement rates need to be increased, especially those affect rural Iowa. And then lastly, a big part of this priority as well is the whole issue of asking the Iowa HHS to ask federal HHS for a Medicaid waiver. So for those prisoners that are housed in county jails, that Medicaid would cover their medical costs all across the board, not only just mental health, but all the medical costs, as this is placed a significant strain on county budgets.
Payments during road construction is a new proposal from the county engineers, largely a technical change, just trying to ensure that it's clear that county engineers can sign off on final payments when construction is complete. And moving on to the final one on this slide, property tax reform, another one of our recommended top priorities from the LPC. I don't think I'm surprising anyone by saying property tax has been and will continue to be something the legislature deals with. So we wanted to make sure that that's top of mind for us as well. And so we'll continue to work as the legislature looks at making adjustments. We want to ensure that counties are still able to have the resources that they need to provide those services at the local level that their constituents are depending on and desiring. And so we'll want to look not only at the property tax system and all of its complications, but also diversifying revenue, looking at costs that continue to rise outside of the control of the county, getting a hold of some of those unfunded, underfunded mandates. So we'll continue that conversation in the 2025 session. Recording fee modernization is a new proposal from the recorders. And like we've seen in the past, another one of those state services at the local level that is largely subsidized by property tax. So a fee modernization would help not only with funding of the recorder's office, but also modernizing their digital infrastructure and the records that they keep.
The next comes from the Community Services Affiliate Retention and Medicaid for Employed Persons with Disabilities. This would allow for those individuals that previously have been kicked out of having Medicaid coverage for these employment programs to go up to 450% of the federal poverty level.
Secondary roads tax reform cleanup is a new one from the county engineers as well. They've identified several areas of unintended consequences with property tax changes, particularly House File 718, some things with the timelines and requirements that they previously had that were or could be affected by property tax changes that weren't really intended. So they have some ideas for getting that cleaned up to make sure everything's still lined up as far as their timelines and their requirements as far as transfers in and out of the secondary road fund. Security interest discharge is the new proposal from the recorders, and this is basically calling for being able to release liens in any county for boats, snowmobiles, ATVs in the recorder's office, but it could be done in any county. And finally, the Treasurer's Omnibus is a combination of several proposals from the treasurers that we've worked on over the last 2 to 3 years. And what we're doing with this proposal is just combining those. Some are related, some are unrelated, but all fall under the treasurer's umbrella and the duties that they perform in their office. So when the legislative session starts, this might look like a couple of bills, or it could be all wrapped into one. We'll kind of get a feel when the session starts on how we might accomplish this, but for purposes of the legislative package, they're all wrapped into one this year. And so let's stop there briefly, take a moment if anyone has any questions on the proposed objectives. And I know we got a question. Let's see if I can pull that up. Can the board just appoint the chair, or do you need a name? That may have been at the tail end, Christy, of your presentation.
Yeah, do you want me to jump in and answer it now?
Yeah, why don't we? That'll give me a chance to catch my breath.
Yeah, no problem. So we will send out a sample resolution. We haven't put that together yet for the county voting representatives to be appointed by the Board of Supervisors. There's nothing in the articles changes that requires a specific name. So I guess I don't see why you couldn't do just the office titles in order to, if you have changes in the officers or department heads. But to touch just something else about that question. So it won't just be the board chair. There won't just be one supervisor representative. It's all elected officials. So all of your supervisors, just like they can now, will continue to be able to vote on ISAC items. So thanks for the question.
All right, and I see a raised hand. If you could type the question into the chat box, that would be great, because we won't be opening up for participants to ask questions directly outside of the chat box. Okay, so moving on to our voting timeline. So again, the purpose, or one of the purposes of today, was to kind of alert you to the online voting. So that will be from October 21st through November 1st. And you will vote on policy statements as a package. The legislative objectives that Jamie and I just went over, you will vote on individually. And then you can recommend up to 5 top priorities. And for policy statements, legislative objectives, and your recommendations for top priorities, there will be an opportunity to submit your comments throughout. And also just a note that the articles amendments that Christy went over will happen at the same time. Voting for that will happen at the same time. So from the online member voting, those recommendations will go to the ISAC Board of Directors. Their November meeting, they will ratify the member vote of the policy statements and the objectives. And then it's also the Board of Directors that sets the top priorities each year. Next slide, please. And just a quick clarification. So, and Christy kind of touched on this, but voting member, all elected officials, and the principal officer. So the easiest way to think about that for me anyway is department heads are voting members. And then For those that happen to be a department head in 2 departments, or for those 2 counties that happen to have a combined auditor recorder, you only get to wear 1 hat when you're voting. So, an easy example might be community services might also do veterans affairs or environmental health and zoning. If you happen to be one of those county officials that has more than 1 hat and more than 1 department that you're the head of, you get to vote once. And I did see maybe another question came up. No, that is posting. Okay, with that, I think we might be ready to move on. Next slide. Yes, okay, so just for clarification, I thought we were ready to go into compensation boards. Just for clarification on the 3 components here. So top priorities are those objectives that kind of rise to the top. Oftentimes they'll cover more than 1 county department, kind of those things that are a county-wide and a statewide impact. The legislative objectives are those items that we covered. In our legislative package, those are displayed as a problem and solution statements. And those things we will get legislation drafted, work it through the process, and hopefully get to the governor's desk by the end of session. And policy statements are kind of guiding principles, longstanding beliefs held by counties and our association. We're not going to get legislation drafted for these, but if bills are introduced or discussions are happening at the Capitol, these are those guiding principles that will guide our work and how we interact with bills that may be introduced. Okay, I think we are ready to move on to compensation boards. So internally, we discussed this and thought it would be a good time to kind of just touch base on county compensation boards, the changes that were made this past legislative session, and just kind of touch base and again offer to answer any questions that counties might have. We know that you're probably starting to think about budgets and all things involved. And that would include how the elected officials are going to be compensated next year and whether counties are going to have a compensation board or not. So just wanted to give kind of an overview. I will direct you to the correspondence from June 27th that addressed some common questions and also included a sample resolution. But just kind of briefly, as you probably know, legislation was passed this last year. Senate File 2442 was largely a tax cleanup bill, but included the compensation board provisions in Division 5. So the main thing to be aware of is county compensation boards were dissolved as of July 1st, 2024. Ultimately, it now goes to the Board of Supervisors in each county to decide whether they want to reestablish a compensation board or take on those responsibilities and requirements themselves. Again, the default would be that if no action is taken, the Board of Supervisors would have the responsibilities and requirements of the compensation board. So the supervisors would need to take action to reestablish the compensation board. This can be done with a simple motion and majority vote of each Board of Supervisors if you wanted to reestablish the compensation board. And ISAC has developed a resolution that I referred to earlier in the June 27th correspondence. If you'd like to use the sample resolution, you can, but again, it could be as simple as a motion, a second, and a majority vote of the Board of Supervisors to reestablish. And I'll also note that you could do that now, you could do that next year or anytime in the future, either to reestablish. If you reestablish now and in a future year want to dissolve the compensation board, you can do that. Code does not prescribe any sort of timelines or restrictions or how long you have to leave it in place, anything like that that we might see in other code sections is not included here. So at any point in the future, if you want to reestablish or dissolve, you can. Next slide, please. So in the cases of reestablishing the compensation board, again, that can be done at any time. I would say give consideration to your typical timeline. So as I said, you're probably starting to think about next year's budgets already. You may be thinking about setting up meetings for union negotiations, looking at wages for all other employees, probably looking at valuations and levy rates. And so I would say this would fall naturally into your normal timelines, your normal process. But if you do want to reestablish a compensation board, that would be the time to be thinking about that, is probably now or the next couple months. Again, a simple motion. You can use the resolution that we developed, or you can develop your own resolution to accomplish this. And just a note, we will be tracking what each county is doing. That'll be a part of the salary survey in the future. And so not only for our use, but for members to see what their counterparts across the state are doing, either reestablishing the compensation board or having the Board of Supervisors do it. And just another little note, so since technically the compensation boards are dissolved as of this past July 1st, those 7 members that were previously serving have no right to incumbency, right? So with the dissolution, if you as an elected official want to make a different appointment, choose someone new, you could do that at this time. I keep joking, without hurting anyone's feelings, since the compensation board was dissolved and they were, for lack of a better term, relieved of their duties. If you wanted to appoint someone new, you could do that. If you wanted to reappoint someone that previously served on the compensation board, if your county is reestablishing it, you could do that as well, completely up to you. Okay, continuing on with reestablishing the compensation board, we are recommending that if you are reestablishing the compensation board, that you would draw lots to determine a minority of the members to serve an initial 2-year term. So 3 of the 7 serve an initial 2-year term. This will be done just to establish that the staggered terms that you currently, or that you previously had in place. The best way that we can think of to do that would be to draw lots for those initial 2-year terms. The responsibilities and requirements of the compensation board remain largely the same. So we saw previous pieces of legislation introduced that simply said the compensation board is dissolved, and the supervisors take over the responsibilities, but they did so by just striking the entire code section with no real requirements or guidance. So what was done with what actually passed this year was leaving that code section largely in place. The requirements, the responsibilities of the compensation board largely remain in place. And I'll note that if the compensation board is not reestablished, those requirements pass directly to the Board of Supervisors. One notable new provision this year is the so-called show your work. This is something that we, as an organization, asked for many years, as we saw proposals each year to get rid of the compensation board or otherwise modify it. Our argument was often, we know it's not a perfect system, but let's try and improve it before we throw it out. And one of those items was, we want the compensation board to justify to the Board of Supervisors how they're coming up with their recommendations. So to put it another way, rather than just coming in with a percentage increase proposal, the Board of Supervisors, I believe, deserves some justification for where that number came from. So what is put in place is the compensation board would need to document the research that they did and justify the recommendations that they come up with. And it's things that have always been in place, such as comparing to similar positions in other counties, other states, private enterprise, and the federal government. Next slide, please. Okay, so if the compensation board is reestablished, the supervisors can handle those recommendations a little bit differently now. So first, the supervisors may approve a compensation schedule that's greater than or less than the compensation board recommendations. So previously, they could only go lower than the recommendation. And additionally, the reductions needed to be the same for all elected officials, with the exception being the Board of Supervisors themselves. So the supervisors could treat each other or treat themselves differently than the rest as far as lowering the recommendation, but the rest had to be tied together. So two things, you can go higher or lower, and the other elected officials no longer tied together for those adjustments. And the final little piece, probably not applicable in many cases, but the supervisors can go lower than a recommendation if the position moves to part-time. The only elected position that can be declared part-time is the county attorney. So the main takeaway from this is probably that just know that the supervisors cannot go below current salary unless there's an adjustment. So for everyone, except for the cases of a county attorney getting moved to part-time, you can't go below current salary. Next slide, please. Okay, if the compensation board is not reestablished, or at some point in the future it's dissolved, as I said, the requirements currently in code are transferred from the compensation board to the Board of Supervisors. This includes the show your work. So you would need to, the Board of Supervisors would need to document the homework that they did and justify their recommendations. One final point that's pretty important: if there is no compensation board, the Board of Supervisors shall set the sheriff's salary so that it's comparable. And these are things currently laid out in code. As you probably know, the compensation board must set their recommendation given these parameters, but the Board of Supervisors can still, if it's a recommendation from the compensation board, can still adjust that. But in the absence of a compensation board, the Board of Supervisors shall set the sheriff's salary with these considerations. Next slide, please. All right, just a few key takeaways, and then we'll check out the questions. Board of Supervisors decides if the county will utilize the compensation board or not. It's automatically dissolved as of July 1st, but the supervisors decide if they want to reestablish or take on the duties themselves. That can be done at any time, now or in the future. The supervisors can go higher or lower than the recommendations, and the other elected officials are no longer linked together. And finally, show your work. The compensation board or the Board of Supervisors must provide documentation and justification for their recommendations. So I am heading over to the questions that have come in. If you reestablish and then abolish following year and then reestablish in a year after, how does that affect the retroactive date of July 1st, 2024 in the legislative language? Okay, so, and Christy, you might have to jump in because I know you were very helpful on the retroactive applicability on when this takes place. But so the dissolution occurred on July 1st. The code lays out that appointments are July 1st. And so in the case of a vacancy, for example, you would fill the unexpired term. So Christy, you might have to help me out with in
Yeah,
future
so I don't
years.
think the bill changed the language that kind of talked about how terms work. And so it says, I pulled this up while you're talking, Lucas, so that's why I'm ready for it. It talks about that the term of the compensation board members is always the 1st of July of the year of appointment. So let's say in 2026, in December of 2026, you decide to reestablish the compensation board. The Board of Supervisors decides to reestablish the compensation board. Then when those compensation board members were appointed, it would date back to July 1 of 2026 for when their terms start. Now, the thing, if you're kind of going back and forth that you may continue to run into, it just says 4-year staggered terms. And if you're appointing a full board, the only way you can kind of get those staggered terms is if you draw names for some of them to have a 2-year term. I think that answers that one, but if there's follow-up questions, just let us know.
Christy, I do have another one that you might be the best person to address. If there's a vacancy created on the compensation board upon change in an elected officer, is the compensation board appointed to? Okay, there's a lot going on here with some parentheses. I think the question is basically getting at if someone new is elected, is the compensation board representative for that office or for that individual? So in other words, does an election for a county office affect who is appointed to the compensation board?
And I think the answer is no. Again, none of this language was kind of changed by the bill. And so it just talks about those 4-year terms. And then it does talk about filling a vacancy, but it doesn't directly talk about it being tied to the person in that office. Now, I suppose sort of behind the scenes, if that's somebody that you really didn't want as your comp board representative, perhaps you could encourage them to resign, but I don't think there'd automatically be a vacancy created.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Please enter those into the chat.
There's
Okay.
one more in the chat. Yeah.
Who would the Board of Supervisors have to show their work to regarding setting salaries? Very good question. They are showing themselves the work to oversimplify it. So the requirement will be put in place. In the case of a compensation board, the justification would be, making the case for the recommendation to the Board of Supervisors. And then, as we all know, the Board of Supervisors needs to look at, what should this position be paid? They're also looking at what are we asking of the taxpayers of our county? And can we do this with our proposed budget and what we have in mind for next year's budget? So in the case of the compensation board not being there, I think what maybe behind this question is, why are we trying to justify this to ourselves if we're the Board of Supervisors? So maybe the best way to think of this is you're also justifying it to the taxpayers and the voters of each county, right? So this would be a public record to say, here are some comparisons to other elected officials in other counties, to some similar state government positions. And so I think the transparency is probably the most important part of that piece. Because the other thing I think of is the Board of Supervisors is not going to go through the motions of recommending to themselves and then rejecting their own recommendations. I don't think, maybe. So I would say it's largely for the transparency to the public that you're going to do the research and document what was found. And this is kind of I think maybe a follow-up to that train of thought is, can elected officials ask to see the supervisor's work to promote transparency on the board's part? Christy, I might have you address that one.
I haven't really thought about this one, but
Right.
I suppose that information would probably be a public record. I can't think of an exception to that. So anytime you've got a public record, anybody could request that. And I think that kind of goes back to the transparency for the public, right, Lucas, that you'd want to share that information.
I think you would. And I think we're pretty consistent in recommending if you can be as transparent as possible, that would be good. One other question that came in, and I think it was clarification on if I'm a newly elected and do not want the person who's on the comp board, I'd have to wait for their term to be up. And I think Christy kind of started to allude to this, that maybe that could be a conversation. Now, I don't think there's anything in code that would provide a path to say, I, as the county treasurer or the county attorney or whoever, did not make the appointment to the person that's supposed to be representing me. I would like a new person. So there's nothing really prescribed in how that would work. But I think if we took a step back and said, okay, how might this actually work in a county? There could be those conversations, right? To say, thinking about appointing someone new, if you happen to step down from this position, I think if we're keeping it 100 about what could actually happen in counties, that would be it. But there's nothing in code that would prescribe how that might occur. So as it is, the appointment stands until it expires, regardless of the county elected official in office. Okay, where can we see the requirements for the Board of Supervisors so we can understand all the paperwork is done and not just ignored? So that is 331.905 is the code section that relates to the compensation board. And the easiest way to think about this is in the absence of a compensation board, everything gets passed on to the Board of Supervisors. And the other thing I'll note, and it's top of mind because I had an unrelated question about when the code comes out. So that might be in November or December when the new Code of Iowa edition is released. So in the meantime, the best way to probably look at the changes that were made would be to go to Senate File 2442, Division 5. Okay. I'm sorry if I missed it, but could you please remind us if and where we can find a salary comparison for all county offices in all counties? So glad you asked, anonymous attendee. The ISAC salary survey is available on our website, and I would direct you there. So that is all the elected officials listed by county. We have all past years, so you can look at trends. We've got information on both elected and non-elected positions, total employment, all kinds of great stuff. I cannot speak highly enough about our salary survey. So iowacounties.org under member resources, salary survey would be a great place to take a look. Okay, Floyd County did a draw for EOs except for the 2 Board of Supervisors, which we just put. Maybe I should read this to myself before I read it out loud, right? Put 1 on a 2-year term. Okay, so I think it's trying to get to how you stagger the terms. So for this particular one, maybe send a follow-up email because it's a very specific, a county-specific question. Okay. And let's see. Molly Hill from our staff will be available for fiscal year 25 by tomorrow or early next week. And I'm assuming that's the salary survey. Thank you, Molly. And just one more comment about specific county case. So I think we have gotten through the Q&A. Again, if it was a specific, something specific to your county, I would ask that you please send a follow-up email. We can address those individually. And at the risk of not coming up with anything, next slide, please. And one more.
That
Okay,
was-
I think
that was the last one.
we've concluded our prepared remarks. If there are any more questions, we can go lbinken@iowacounties.org or support@iowacounties.org. And Jamie, I think I will turn it back over to you for some closing comments, perhaps.
I would be happy to, Lucas. So yes, what you've received before you is not only what we're going to be considering and voting on coming up when voting begins coming up here at the end of October. And like Lucas mentioned, from those recommendations, it will go to the full ISAC Board of Directors for ratification. At any time, certainly as you review the package, when it's the full package, when it's sent out to you, please reach out to Lucas and myself. Lucas provided his email, and please don't hesitate, as you always do, and reach out to me as well, jcashman@iowacounties.org. So with that, we want to thank everybody for joining us today for that webinar, and we hope you have a pleasant day.